So last time we talked about biodiversity in general. So now we're going to cover chapters 4 and 5, talking about ecosystem and genetic diversity. A little note about chapter 5 in the book. When you're reading along, it gets kind of technical and goes pretty in depth on some things. And for this course and the scope of it, you don't really need to go that deep into those details. So for chapter 5, you just want to read the pages here, about what's genetic diversity and why it's important, and the little bit about cultural diversity there. That'll save a lot of math. So what are ecosystems? Like, what is an ecosystem? Okay, so when you hear that word, what do you think about? Well, we think about something like this, right? And so an ecosystem is going to be all the biological components, all the species, plus all the abiotic things, like rocks and trees and not trees, but rocks and air and water and things like that. So just from looking at these two pictures, it can kind of give you an idea of how the place is, right? So what do you think the climate would be like where these two pictures are taken? So the one on the left, for instance, give you a second to think about that. So it could be, it's probably a temperate forest, right? It's a deciduous forest. It could be like here in eastern Kentucky. That would look similar to the photo on the left. The photo on the right, we see some saw palmettos, and we're seeing some Spanish moss hanging on the trees. So we're like, well, this stuff don't grow here, and it looks different. So it's going to be a warmer, hotter kind of place. So it's going to be some coastal plain area of the southeastern U.S. So it's going to be hotter, wetter, that kind of thing. So we can by seeing which species live in an area, we can extrapolate and make inferences about the climate there, because the species are going to be adapted to the climate that's where they live. Right, and so this is eastern Kentucky. It's Red River Gorge, and the species here, they're adapted to it, right? The Everglades, it's different. They got different species there. Does it get as cold? It's wetter. Those sorts of things, right? So each species that's within an ecosystem is going to be adapted to that climate and that region. So as scientists, if you're an ecologist, you study ecosystem. So how do we define these? Well, if we look at this Landsat image of Oregon, we can see in western Oregon, near the coast, it's really, really green, like super green. And it's also really, really wet. They have these temperate rainforests. They get like hundreds of inches of rain a year there. So it's really, really wet. Well, then we got these big mountains, the Cascade Range. And on the other side of the mountains, we get the desert. There's like very little rain. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that's due to the rain shadow effect. But this area where they meet, where these two ecosystems come together, this transition zone, we call that an ecotone. Ecotones are where two different ecosystems meet. So in this picture here, it would be like that. The edge of a pond would also be an ecotone. And there's usually gradual transitions. There's never, just like in the picture, it's a gradual transition in that image. You're never going to have, I say never, usually you're not going to have a very abrupt transition from one habitat to a next in nature. It's going to be a gradual change. And an ecosystem can be really variable in size, right? There can be a tiny mud puddle in the forest that allows salamanders and frogs to lay their eggs and survive. Or they could be the massive, vast tundra of northern North America and Eurasia. Millions of acres. Ecosystems vary in size. And when we do see ecosystems that vary abruptly, that aren't a gradual transition like an ecotone, it's usually because of people. We're bush hogging it, we are mowing it, we're putting a road on it, we're doing something, because nature doesn't typically do this sharp transition thing. And so when that happens, we call this the edge effect. And it's where two ecosystems come up to each other, but there's no ecotone. There's no gradual transition. It's just an abrupt change. So if we look at ecosystems around the world and we look at the broad scale at the world level, we can kind of classify all the ecosystems into large categories. And we call these biomes. A biome is going to be a region of the world with a unique climate and vegetation pattern. So here we have the major world biomes, right? So we have ice, not a lot of vegetation in ice, and it's pretty cold. Then we have tundra, we have the taiga, we have temperate forest, chaparral, grassland, desert, tropical savanna, tropical rainforest, and mountains. And these are, across the world, we've got all these, represented in different places because there's different elevations, different amounts of rainfall, different annual temperatures, average annual temperatures, and lots of these things. And so because of those differences in temperature and climate, you get differences in vegetation. All right, so if we look at the temperate deciduous forest, it's going to be dominated by broadleaf trees, and it has seasons. So it goes, summer, winter, summer, fall, winter, spring. Right? We have these seasonal changes. This is our biome here in eastern Kentucky. Okay, and in most of, all of eastern North America really is this biome. And then we can go out west. Maybe you've gone to Utah or New Mexico, or Arizona, or someplace out there, and see it's drastically different than here. And we have the deserts. The world deserts, a lot of Africa is desert, as you can see on the map there. But across the world, deserts are going to be characterized by little to no precipitation. So they have very little annual rainfall. Sometimes it might not rain at all in a year. So usually it's 10 inches or less of rain a year to classify deserts. And the plants that live there are really, really tough, right? Because if you're a plant and, if you have a house plant, you got to water it. Well, if you live in some place that's sunny and hot all the time and it only rains once every 2 years, you got to be pretty daggone tough. And so in these places, the plants are going to be really waxy to prevent water loss. They're going to have really thick leaves. This is where cacti hang out. They're going to have thorns to protect themselves because, the little bit of water you've got, you don't want something chewing on you to get at it and take it away. So plants are going to be, highly adapted to these regions. They'll have water storage organs and all these sorts of things. So deserts are characterized as having very little rainfall, and the plants are going to not be really big, and they're going to be really tough. They're going to be thick, waxy, that kind of thing. If we go a little bit more rain, so now we've gone from, the 10 inches or less, now we're up to, we're in 20, 25 inches of rain, maybe up to 35. These places we're going to have grasslands. So grasslands have a little bit more rain than a desert, still not as much as a forest, as a deciduous forest. And in these places, grasses dominate. That's why they're called grasslands. There's a lot of species of grasses that can live in these, thousands across the world. But if you go to a grassland in Oklahoma, to a grassland in Brazil, to a grassland in Australia, just from a distance, they're going to look kind of the same. And the deserts also. When you get up close, there's going to be different species of plants, but they're going to have structurally the same kind of look because grasses all kind of look like grass. And if we go up in elevation, so up into the mountains, mountains get colder as they go higher. And so at high elevation, you're going to have coniferous forest in the mountains. And then if you go higher, even still, I believe it's around 12,000 feet at the moment. Above that, you're going to end up with no vegetation at all. It's too cold and too dry. And there, have the snowy mountain peaks, and there's no plants that grow up there at all. So, like these snow-capped mountains, think, like Mount Everest, there's no plants on top of Mount Everest, for instance. So if you go high enough. And so these different regions, they have different amounts of rain, different geographies around the world, and it creates these different biomes. But why do we have different temperatures? Why isn't the temperature just the same all around the world all the time? And it's got to do with the fact that the Earth spins around the sun, and the Earth is tilted. It's not straight up and down. So it has a 23.5-degree tilt. And this axial tilt, as it's called, is why northern and southern latitudes experience seasons. Like here in Kentucky, we have, the 4 seasons. If you were in Australia, parts of it, you would have the 4 seasons, parts of South America, like way down south, you would have the 4 seasons. But if you are near the equator, equatorial parts of the world, you don't really have seasonal changes, seasonal differences. I have a friend who lives in northern Brazil, and her eggplants are trees. Eggplants there, the winter doesn't kill them because they don't really have winter. And so they have similar temperatures all year round there. And it's all because the way the Earth is tilted. And in the summertime, the northern hemisphere, we are pointing towards the sun. So we get more hours of sunshine. It gets warmer. It gets hotter. And then in our winter, the southern hemisphere is pointed towards the sun. And so they get more hours of sunshine and more days. So like our winter is summer in the southern hemisphere for them. Okay, so that's why. That's what controls the temperature. Major temperature differences is spinning of the Earth, tilt of the axis. So what controls the major rainfall differences? There's a couple different things. The biggest, most major are these Hadley cells, as they're called, that are big circles in the atmosphere. These big circles in the atmosphere, where we have the air rising up. It's going to be cool when it comes down. It gets warmed on the surface, and then it starts rising, and it's full of water. And when it rises, it's just like at night when the dew falls on your yard. This is going to come up, it's going to cool off, and then it can't hold as much water anymore, so that water is going to fall as rain. So we get a bunch of rain where these cells rise. So around the equator, it's really wet. Kind of where we live, it's really wet. Way down here in southern South America, it's really wet. But in between, it's really dry. We get the world's deserts. So desert here, and the polar regions are deserts also. They're just cold. And this is because that cold air that's falling out of the upper atmosphere has very little water in it, and it's falling because it's cold, and cold air is denser than warm air, so it falls down. Since there's no water in it, it sucks all the water out of the ground and makes deserts. So we look around the world, we've got these bands about 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south, and 60. 30 and 60 is where the deserts are. This holds true. We can have small areas that experience different climates due to topography, like mountains and stuff, but for the most part, this pattern holds true, right? So if we look at the world map where rainforests fall, they're on the equator. Most of the world's rainforests are on the equator. We do have this temperate rainforest, right, here in the Pacific Northwest, that's caused by some ocean currents up here. And there's, Southeast Asia and a rainforest, but usually the equatorial regions are where the rainforests are. And you can see the deserts on here too. The deserts are in yellow. Okay. So if we do have a big mountain, like the picture we saw of Oregon, where we have the rainforest on one side of the mountains, on the other side we have a desert. This is caused by mountains. We call this the rain shadow effect. And if the mountain's big enough, we can have huge latitudinal changes in a very short distance because we go up the mountain, right? So it's something like I don't remember exactly, but something like for every 1,000 feet up in elevation, you go 500 miles in latitude. So if we look at a big mountain, like this could be in like, I don't know, Wyoming, maybe, this mountain, it's in Yellowstone. So down here, down by the river, we got temperate forest. Then we go up, we end up with boreal forest. We go a little bit higher, we got vegetation, but no trees, so we got tundra. When we go all the way to the top, we have permanent ice. And so this is similar to the latitudinal gradient on Earth, but it's compressed into a mountain. So it's a very small geographic area. When we have these mountains, right, so like here we'd have our temperate deciduous forest. Come up, we'd have our coniferous forest, and then we would hit tundra where there's small alpine plants but no trees. Then we get the top where it's snow-capped. What happens is we have moist air coming in and it hits this mountain, so it has to rise. And remember, just like when we saw at the equator, why it rains so much there, when the wet air has to go up, it cools off. When it cools off, it has to get rid of water, so it rains. And so we got this moist air coming up, going up the mountain, and as it goes up, it cools down, and it rains, and it rains, and it rains. And this is the predominant wind direction. This happens a lot, right? And so it goes all the way up, and all the water falls out. And now we've got dry air. It's cold, but dry. And it's up here, and it comes over the other side of the mountain and comes down, and it's like there's no rain. It's just dry. So it's going to suck water out of the soil. It's going to evaporate. Like relative humidity would be another way of looking at this. It'd be really low over here and really high over here. We're talking like 90% humidity, kind of like Kentucky in August. And over here, it might be 15% humidity or 10, like really low, which makes stuff dehydrate really fast. So that's what's called the rain shadow effect, meaning the leeward side, the side away from the wind, creates deserts with mountains. Okay, so we've seen that the tropics are wetter, that they're rainforest and not deserts. And so now we're going to look at why there are more species in the tropics. So we look at the Amazon rainforest in South America. There's a lot of stuff there. We got the Amazon River, we got this huge, vast, forest. We don't even really know how old it is for sure, because the cool, interesting thing about tropical trees is they don't make rings like our trees do. You may, in temperate regions where we experience seasons and the trees go dormant in the winter, they make growth rings. Like cut down an oak tree in Kentucky, you can see rings in it. Well, if you go to Brazil and you got this big giant rainforest tree and you cut it down, I mean, it's got structures the same as our trees have rings. The same structures are in there, but it doesn't lay them down in nice, neat rings. And so you can't just look at them and tell how old it is. So some of these may be really, really super old, and we just aren't sure. But if we look at our rainforest, there are tons of species here. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But they're getting cut down at a crazy high rate. So this map shows in green the remaining tropical rainforest of the world, and the red are ones that have been cleared. So that, at this scale, that is huge, right? I mean, these are like millions and millions of acres that have been cleared for predominantly farming. Usually, like in Brazil here, it's for cattle, soybeans. They'll cut down the rainforest for that. Over here, it's for like palm oil and just for land for housing in India, but it's types of farming that are not sustainable in the long run. And so in the blue, it's other biodiversity hotspots around the world, meaning there's large concentrations of endemic species. But why do we care so much about tropical rainforests? Well, tropical rainforests are really cool. And on land in the tropics, you get a rainforest. In the oceans, you get coral reefs. So our coral reefs are around the equator in the oceans, and they're in bad shape right now. If you read about it much, like the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia was the world's largest coral reef. Super diverse, had more species of fish than like anywhere else in the oceans. and a huge portion, I think it was like 80% of it's dead, um, due to acidification and warming of the oceans, which is caused by stuff we're doing. We'll see that in a little bit. So why do the tropics have high biodiversity? Why are there so many species in the tropics? Be that in the coral reefs having the most fish, or be it in the forest having the most species of plants. What's the recipe for success? And there's been a lot of biologists for a lot of years discussed this, and there's some kind of consensus ideas, some reasons that have came up. So one is it's always getting a lot of sunshine. The reason trees in Kentucky lose their leaves is not because it gets too cold, it's because they don't get enough sunshine in the winter. So we get so little solar radiation in the winter that plants can't grow very well. Like there's some small stuff, in your yard that grows, but that's why trees lose their leaves here. But in the tropics, they always get the same amount. They're always getting a bunch because they're always pointed at the sun. So they get high solar energy. That's important. They also have warm temperatures. It's always warm. So if you live here in the summertime, it's really hot, so you're going to sweat and that kind of stuff. And then in the winter, it's going to be really cold, so you're going to have to wear a coat. But in the tropics, it's just always warm. Never gets cold. These plants and animals never have to adapt to freezing temperatures, because think about it, ice, when a tree freezes, there's ice in there. How does it control that, and come back from it? And if it's an animal, it doesn't have to hibernate. Bears and stuff that hibernate, they don't have to do that in the tropics. So the warm temperatures let them kind of use their energy for other stuff. It's also wet. It's really wet. And being wet allows for more life to happen because we all need water. And they also have a little bit less disturbance traditionally than the rest of us. So there's not a lot of fire. Like the western U.S. right now is burning and people are freaking out. But historically, it's always burned. For the last 20,000 years, 10,000 years at least, it's burned ever so often. And so that's kind of a natural part of that ecosystem. Well, the tropical rainforest, they don't burn. And so that's a huge disturbance that's not there. So we've got other things, the weather, the climate, and all that. And so if we look at stakes, and we take two stakes, and we put one in tropical rainforest, that would be here where it's hot. We put one over here in a cold place, say like northern Canada, and what's going to happen? Is this one going to rot faster than this one, or is this one going to rot faster? Well, the warmer temperatures are going to make it rot much faster. This is why we have refrigerators in our house, to put food in it to keep it from rotting as fast. So in the tropics, nutrients cycle, things grow faster, just all the above. It's like really nice conditions for growth, which allows for more species to be there. Okay, so on the course Blackboard site, underneath the course documents, there's a folder that says extra resources. Underneath that are some YouTube videos, one of which is this one, Pole to Pole, Planet Earth Episode 1. It's about 40-45 minutes. I would like you to watch it because you'll get to see all the different biomes of Earth. And they go through them. So that's pretty cool. Watch that. Some stuff from it will be on the test. And it's really interesting, Good cinematography and stuff. Okay. So I'm going to pretend we took a 45-minute break to watch that video, because you're going to watch it. And now we're going to look at how do we value ecosystems. So if we were going to build a road, we could build it up one valley, or we could build it up the other valley, and we got to pick which one. We're going to look at the ecosystems in there and be like, well, maybe this one's better than that one, or whatever. And so we have ways that we kind of value stuff, and so that's part of this. And other parts are just, why should we conserve it at all, right? So how do we put a value on ecosystems, and why do we care, basically, is what this is going to be about. So ecosystems can have an intrinsic value. right? And so that just means that the species that are there, they have a right to exist in and of themselves. We shouldn't play God and make them go extinct. Okay, and so there's this two ideas that these ecosystems are going to be tightly connected. They got a bunch of closely co-evolved species um, that work together. The one eats the other one's poop, and then that one eats the other one's eggs, and there's just cycles and food webs and everything's interconnected. Or there's this other idea that is an ecosystem is just going to be a loose assemblage of species that happen to share the same habitat needs and end up interacting with one another, like on the right here. Most ecologists, the vast majority of ecologists, would tell you that it's the thing on the left is how it is. Some would say it's the thing on the right, but almost everyone would agree that these species have co-evolved together and sometimes are interdependent upon one another. And a lot of people, a lot of conservation biologists, think about species within an ecosystem. Let's think about a bridge. That bridge is your ecosystem. Every rivet, every bolt, every truss, that's a species. And so if you start taking out rivets on that bridge, you might be able to lose a couple. A couple fell out. Semi trucks are still good driving over it. But you take 10 out, now it's weakened. Now it's going to collapse, right? And so there's going to be a tipping point. But a lot of people think of species within ecosystems kind of in that context, that they're interconnected and they depend on each other, and the whole system needs them to work. So that's intrinsic values. They matter for their own right. We can have what we call instrumental values, and these are kind of things we place on them. They're values people, intrinsic values are sort of values we put on them too, but they don't have to do anything for us to have intrinsic values. Instrumental values, they gotta kind of do something for us. Okay, so we're gonna look at these things ecosystems can have. The first is economic. Money talks. People care about money, right? So what are the economic values of ecosystems, right? They deliver free ecosystem services. And so what is an ecosystem service? Well, this is where they're doing something that you would otherwise have to pay for. So for instance, clean water and clean air. Right? Those trees are sucking in air, and if there's pollution in it, they're sucking that in too. And in small amounts, they can filter it out. Too much, and you kill the tree, and you clog up your filter, and it dies. But in small and moderate amounts, they can take care of that for us, and it provides billions of dollars worth of services um, that we would otherwise have to pay for. So that's pretty sweet. Water, clean water. You may, if you've ever been hiking in a forest and you saw the creek, the water's going to look really clear and nice versus, if you see the water like the Ohio River going through Cincinnati, it looks pretty rough at that point. It's going to be pretty polluted. And so if the people in Cincinnati have to pay a lot of money to treat their water to make it drinkable versus, if you're in a forested system, a more natural setting, the nature will filter it mostly for you. Right? Maybe you have a well. Maybe you live out in the country and you have a well. You get free water because nature filtered it for you. Okay, so that's how that is. We can also have ecosystems that provide economic services by having tourism, right? So we have these unique ecosystems, such as this dwarf cypress swamp near Apalachicola, Florida, that make money for local citizens and help local and state economies. So look at your state parks. Like, for instance, close to where we live here, we have Carter Caves and Red River Gorge. These are two natural areas that have unique ecosystems, and a lot of people go visit them. Those people are going to buy gas at the local gas station. They're going to buy food at the local restaurant. They might stay in the local hotel. They might buy stuff, while they're in town. And so they're putting huge amounts of money into local economies through tourism. So these ecosystems are making money for the regions around them just by existing. They're just there. Sometimes, and psychological studies have shown actually that spending time in nature will lower cortisol levels, which is your stress hormone, and will lower your perceived level of stress. So if you're really stressed out, you go for a walk in the woods, you go paddle a kayak on a lake, it's going to release your stress, and you're going to have a much lower stress level. And that's been proven scientifically. But beyond just that, we can have spiritual feelings about nature, right? So if we go to Ireland and we look at this cool rock outcrop here called the Giant's Causeway, it's surreal, like it was thought to be, a walkway for giants in there, long time ago, and myth and lore of Ireland, and it's just super surreal to be there, and it's a spiritual experience. Makes you feel small. Even just walking through a field, field of flowers, can do wonders for your stress. Watch the bugs pollinate the flowers, smell them, just hang out, get out of the office, get out of the house, makes you feel better, right? And even, religious leaders, right? So religious experiences can occur in the wilderness. If you follow the Bible, it talks about Jesus praying in the wilderness, right? He goes out into the wilderness to pray because that was where he went to have his spiritual experiences. So nature can be very spiritual, and has actually been proven to lower stress hormone levels. We can also use ecosystems to educate, like this class we're educating. The Lion King, right? So some entertainment comes from that, but then at the same time, it's educating. The Lion King movie educates little kids about the circle of life, right? Everybody gets old, everybody dies, and that's kind of the big theme in this movie. So it's using a natural system to present that message. We can have classroom stuff, that's from nature, for people to study, to look at, to inspire them. And we can have places that we do scientific research, right? So like an herbarium, it's a library or a catalog of all the plants on Earth or from a region. These herbaria, they catalog these things. Some of these species are extinct now. They only exist in these collected specimens that we have in the herbarium. And so we can use that for genetic research, for population studies. There's tremendous amounts of data that can be obtained just from these herbarium specimens. So we get scientific. We can learn new things and create new knowledge, which is what the goal of scientists would create new knowledge, right? And so we can do that with these ecosystems, and otherwise we wouldn't be able to. We have areas, ecosystems that are protected, that allow, have places for bunks and that sort of thing, and allow students to come and learn. And so this would be like a picture of a biological field station. And at these places, we both conduct scientific research and we train students to be the future scientists at these places. So that. And we can have some strategic and ecological values. So like mineral pools. There are species of archaea and bacteria that live in these that occur nowhere else on Earth. The wildfires out west right now are popular in the news. Well, water would slow a wildfire, right? They're spraying it. So if you got a big river, it could be like a fire line and keep the fire from crossing. So that'd be a strategic value. If you got houses on one side, you can use this ecosystem, this river, to help you protect it. Coastal sand dunes are really important barriers to protect more fragile ecosystems behind them. Like when a hurricane comes and the waves are getting big, the sand dunes, they can handle the salt and the waves, but maybe the stuff behind them can't handle the salt. And so they kind of protect, they lessen the impacts of the waves, and they absorb the salt and all that. So coastal dunes help protect fragile stuff behind them. And then we can have species that we use strategically within conservation, and it allows us to protect bigger areas and other things, right? So if we look at the river otter and the Florida manatee, by protecting them and their habitat, we protect a lot of other things that are less well known and maybe less liked by the public. Maybe there's some freshwater mussels, maybe there's some crayfish, maybe there's some grass that lives in these places that's now being protected because we strategically saved the manatee, or we saved the river otter because they're cute and furry and people like cute furry things. And by doing that, we are saving other species as well. Okay. So let's look at these following places here and think about what kind of values, what kind of instrumental values people would place on them or could place on them. And there's multiple ones for each of them that you could do. But think about that for a moment, and then we'll see what we can come up with. So if we look at the coastal dunes, they have the strategic value of protecting whatever's behind them. If you have a house in South Carolina and it's behind the dunes, it has a much greater odds of surviving a hurricane than if it's sitting up there in the dunes. They're going to reduce the force of the waves and all that. Wetlands are amazing filters. You can take really crappy water, run it through a wetland, it comes out the other side really clean. In fact, you can do this with sewage treatment. It takes a large wetland, but for like home scale, you can, instead of having a leach bed for your septic system, you can run it through a wetland, like cattails and that kind of thing, and it will purify the water and come out the other side clean. Of the open ocean, what value does that have for us? You're looking at it, you're like, that's no value, there's nothing there. Well, we can place value on that in the form of, you like to breathe, right? And so 2/3 of the oxygen that you breathe came from there. Cyanobacteria and algae that are floating around in the open ocean make oxygen for you to breathe. We can look at rivers and streams, right? And so what value do they have? Well, maybe you like to fish. Maybe you just wading in the creek fishing gives you like a spiritual experience, so that would be good. Maybe it's a water source, so maybe it's got some economic use of people pay money to put in kayaks. Like the local small town I live in, they just built a kayak launch and built bathrooms and made a camping area because so many people were wanting to kayak down the river there. And so that brings money in. People are camping there, they're eating at the local restaurants, they're buying gas at local gas stations, so it's putting money in. Coastal swamps, they really help with storm surge. Can't be stressed enough how much swamps and wetlands help control flooding. It may sound counterintuitive to get this big wet spot that's going to control flooding, but they're like big sponges. They can absorb a whole lot of water and then they let it out really slow. And that's what you want to prevent flooding. Tropical rainforests, there are lots of things going on there that make a lot of products for us, a lot of foods, a lot of wood. And there's a lot of species that are just, endemic to there and don't occur anywhere else. So we can have a lot of values that we can place on tropical rainforests. So if we look at economics, how much money do we make per thing, right? So if we look at per acre of land, dollars per year, coastal regions, they're the most. Make a lot of money off coastal areas because everybody wants to go to the beach, mostly. That's what's going on there, right? But we look at the open ocean, we don't make very much per acre, but there's so much of it, it's worth a whole lot of money. And you can think, where does money come from here? Fishing, right? Like we can get a lot of fish and boating and shipping channels and all that stuff. We look at wetlands, there's very few of them, but they are the most valuable habitat on Earth per acre. Wetlands are. Tropical rainforests are pretty good. Lakes and rivers, second most valuable. So water, right? Wetlands, most valuable habitat on Earth per dollar. Rivers and lakes, second most. Other forests, they're not worth as much. They're worth a little bit. Grasslands are worth even less. And this is where all, you're like, this is where all the cows eat. It's where cows eat, right? Cows eat grass. So this is where they're hanging out. Cropland, which is what we think, you think you make money farming, right? You got the soybean field, you got the corn field, you got the $1 million worth of combines, and you're barely making ends meet. But with cropland, it is the least valuable per acre um, using ecological economics. So it's the least valuable. So you might sound crazy. You're just like, I got this hillside behind my house. It ain't worth nothing. And I got this little bottom that I plow and plant corn in, and I make, it's worth this. But as far as services as a whole to society, it ain't worth much compared to everything else. So this is a cool little study to show you, how many trillions of dollars per year it puts into the economy, or it could be that it saves that much money, right? It's money that you didn't have to spend, so you can spend it on something else. That could be another way to look at this. So now let's get into some chapter 5 stuff and look at genetic diversity. So, what is a gene? First of all, what is a chromosome? What's an allele? Well, a chromosome is a big cluster of your DNA. And a gene is going to be a section of DNA that codes for proteins. A gene is going to be a piece of DNA that has the blueprint or the recipe card for a protein. And an allele is going to be a variation in that. So an allele is a variation in a gene. So in this case, these two different chromosomes, which we are what we call diploid organisms, meaning we have two sets of chromosomes just like that. You got one from mom, you got one from dad. And so we got two sets. And well, we have a set. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And these genes in this spot on each chromosome, that's, say chromosome number 1, the one you got from mom, the one you got from dad, at each certain spot, they both code for the same kind of stuff. Like in this instance, in this picture, it's flower color, right? That gene is the flower color gene for this plant. Well, just so happens on one chromosome, it's going to be purple. On the other chromosome, it says be white. And so these different variations of the gene are called alleles. They're going to be variations in the same gene. So they both give the flower its color, they just give it different colors. So that's what we call an allele. Okay. How do we get these differences? Where do they come from? Well, there's several ways. One is recombination. So when genes and chromosomes get mixed up in sperm and egg, the offspring are going to be genetically different than the parent. Because when you make sperm and you make egg, or a plant makes these or whatever, because plants have sperm too, by the way. Yeah, they do. The sperm and egg, when they get made, you create totally novel combinations of genes. It's not stuff you inherited from your mom or you inherited from your dad. You mix that together and you make a new thing that you then give your offspring. And so this allows for potentially totally new traits to come about within a population, and it increases the genetic diversity within the population. Because now your kid is not exactly like you. They might be better at basketball than you ever could have thought about being, right? And so they could be worse also, but the possibility of being better is out there, and that's what this is all about. So since we have two copies of every gene, we could have two different alleles. The one I got from mom might say have red hair. The one I got from dad might say have black hair. And so I'm going to have different traits, right? And so this is what we call our genotype. The combination of alleles for a given trait is genotype. In this case, AA for flower color or whatever. Our phenotype is what we can actually see. It's the physical manifestation of the genotype. This could be behavior, could be biochemical, it could be just physical looks, like you got red hair or you got blue eyes. That's your phenotype. And so it's not only controlled by your genotype. So let's look at this little diagram. All right, so we have these two different genotypes. We got genotype 1, genotype 2. Put them in the same environment, let them grow up. They look different. We end up with different phenotypes. Okay, but now let's come down here. We got the exact same genotype. We got clone 1, clone 2. Could be identical twins or whatever. Okay, then we put them in different environments. Put this one, this one, put this one, this one. Now they look different. We got different phenotypes coming out of the exact same DNA. We make them look different, and this is happens a lot. And your environment matters. You know, how you're raised, where you live, what you eat, all that kind of stuff can affect how your DNA gets expressed into the phenotype that we see. So what is this? This is talking about if we had an ideal population, which doesn't always happen. But if we did, we have some genes that are dominant. Some alleles, so let's say mom has blonde hair, dad has black hair, they have 15 kids, every kid has black hair. Well, what happened? Well, that means that the black hair gene would be dominant. And so the dominant gene is always going to be expressed in the phenotype. So if we have homozygous dominant, meaning you got 2 copies of the dominant gene, that's a no-brainer. You're going to look, this is what's going to be the only DNA, the only gene you can express. But if you're heterozygous, so you got a blonde hair gene and a black hair gene, then you're going to express whatever this is, the dominant. So if you're heterozygous, you're going to express the dominant most of the time. Okay. You could, however, get 2 blonde hair genes. That'd be homozygous recessive, in which case you'd be blonde-headed in this little scenario I just made up. And in the ideal population, you'd have 25% of your population would be this, 50% would be this, 25% would be this. However, that hardly ever is really out there in the real world. It doesn't exist. Okay. And within these genotypes that we're looking at, big A, big A, big A, little a, little a, little a, we got these 2 different alleles. One allele came from mom, one allele came from dad. And that's what makes up our genotype. So if we are breeding together, we're creating things, hair color, flower color, that sort of thing. We got to be able to interbreed, right? So we got to be the same species. But we could, kind of like all mammals have hair. Okay, so we've still got some traits that we share with other stuff. So let's look at the different levels of genetic diversity. We can be pretty distantly related, right? So genetically distinct things that are in separate taxonomic families, or even farther apart, right? So you got cats and dogs. They're both mammals, but they're in different families, so they're pretty different. Alligators and crocodiles, same way, different families, pretty different. An alligator and a dog, they're pretty different. So at this level, we're pretty distinct. But at the family level, you're still going to share traits with your cousins, right? So like the alligator and the dog are different orders. So this is a higher taxonomic level, right? They look a whole lot different, more different than a cat and a dog and a crocodile and an alligator. They're more similar. So once you're within your family, it's kind of like your cousin Joe, that crazy uncle you got. You might not like them, but you got some stuff in common with them. So that's how this is, right? And so then if we get down to the genus level, it's the next, we're zooming in now, we're one step closer. At the genus level, we got a lot more in common. We're going to look more similar, have more of the same traits. So, for instance, domesticated dogs and coyotes are both in the same genus, but they're separate species still. But, coyotes kind of look like dogs, and dogs kind of look like coyotes, more so than a dog looks like a cat, for instance, right? So they're in the same genus. And then if we get within the genus, we can have what are called sibling species. And so these are going to be species that are in the same genus, but they're closely related. Okay, so we could have kind of distantly related species in the same genus, or we could have ones that all came, they have similar traits and they look kind of the same and they're more recently evolved from one another, and we call these sibling species. We can have population genetic diversity, and this can be intense. Think about dogs. Great Danes versus Chihuahuas. Same species, different populations. So there's some variation there. Or if we think about horticulture and farming, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, turnips, broccoli, and kale are all members of the same species. Same species. They all came from the same ancestral thing, and you can still crossbreed them. You can hybridize them. but they're genetically distinctive populations. You know, cabbage don't look like broccoli, and cauliflower don't look like a turnip, but they're still possible. It's still possible for them to hybridize, so they're the same species. And many of our domesticated crops and animals that come from artificial selection, right? So like this, we choose them based on traits we like. You know, if I grow a garden and I'm saving my seeds, I'm only going to save seeds from something that did good, that I liked the taste of, that had the traits I was looking for. And so over time, I might develop whole novel, you know, I might develop cabbage instead of cauliflower, right? So for instance, so that's how that happens. You just look around in your everyday lives, even within humans, we have a lot of genetic diversity amongst populations, amongst individuals. Um, we're genetically distinct from one another. We're very similar, but we still have differences. So um, this genetic diversity increases your odds of survival. If your population has more diversity, that's good. Higher diversity is always better, because with greater genetic diversity, a population or a species is more likely able to evolve in response to a changing environment. There's this classic study in England that occurred in the late 1800s. It's this moth called the pepper moth. So the pepper moth hangs out on trees in London, I guess. I'm not sure what city, but in England on trees. Well, back in the olden days, before we were burning the crap out of fossil fuels all the time, most of the moths are white because the tree bark was light in color. So they're light gray and white, and they could hide really well, and the birds come along. And if you're a kind of dark colored moth, you get eaten because it's easy to see you. Well, the Industrial Revolution comes along. We start burning coal with no scrubbers, no emission control, anything. It's just a straight pipe. So we're letting out tons and tons of soot. Everything gets really dirty. All this coal ash falls all over the town. All the trees turn black from all the ash. Those few moths that were in the population, they were the minority, but they were there, that had the ability to be dark colored. Well, now they're hard to see. So the light colored ones all get eaten by the birds, and they become much more abundant. And there's this, it's a cool classic study about the pepper moths in England. Um, we saw this, you know, we actually witnessed this happen. Okay, so depending on, if there were no dark ones back in the beginning, none of them would survive here, right? So having high genetic diversity allows you to cope with stresses and changes in the environment and things like that, like climate change. If we look at cheetahs, you know, cheetahs are famous for being the fastest land animal on Earth, right? They can run pretty quick. It's like 70 miles an hour or something. They can't go very far that fast, but they can run that fast. Something happened a long time ago, and all the cheetahs are now very genetically similar. They're super closely related, to the extent that many cheetahs now are born sterile or stillborn, and they have problems having babies because it's like they're all brothers and sisters. They're very genetically similar. And this is caused by what's called inbreeding. Inbreeding, the definition of it, is mating between individuals with similar genetics, and this tends to lead to more homozygosity, meaning you'd have more big A, and more little a, less heterozygosity, which would be big A, little a, right? So this is, you know, same reason why you don't want to marry your cousin. Don't want to have sterile babies like cheetahs. Okay. Outbreeding, on the other hand, is going to be mating between individuals who have different genetics, which increases your heterozygosity, which will increase the diversity. So outbreeding does that. And if we look at cougars, right, the Florida panther, there were very few of these left. I think it was like 30 of them or something were left in the world. And so biologists got Florida panthers, and they got mountain lions, which were the same species but different subspecies. They're really different. Like mountain lions that live out west, high, dry mountains. Florida panther, it lives in the Everglades swamps. So they're like kind of different. And so they got them together and bred them because they didn't want them to be like the cheetahs, right? Where's my pointer here? Yeah, so we didn't want the cheetah story to happen with the Florida Panthers. But what can happen there, we have what's called outbreeding depression can happen. Over time, we'll slowly lose the genetics of the Florida Panther if they keep breeding more and more mountain lions into the population. Right? So that can be bad, but what you gonna do? This word fitness doesn't mean that you went to Gold Gym and you can do 60 reps on the bench press or whatever. Fitness means the ability to produce viable offspring relative to other members of your species. Viable offspring means a kid that can have kids, right? So if you have 50 kids and they all have kids, you're really fit. If you have no kids, you're not very fit. So that's kind of how fitness is described. Your ability to make offspring that can make offspring in relation to other members of your species. Okay. So why do we care? What's the utilitarian use of genetic diversity, right? What do we get from genetic diversity in nature? Well, a beefalo. We take domesticated cattle and we got wild bison, the buffalo, out west. There's still a few of them left, right? So we can take those, we can breed them together. Now we get this giant cow thing that A, has a whole lot more meat on it, and B, people pay a premium for, so we can make more money. Right? People like money. So that's an example of a genetic diversity. We're increasing the diversity in that population and making these beefalos. Okay? Corn. We take the wild relatives of corn, we breed them with modern corn to try to increase the resistance to certain pests. We're doing that with a lot of crops, not just corn. But look at potatoes. Potatoes are native to here in these mountains, the Andes Mountains. This is where potatoes are native. Potatoes are grown here, big time here, big time here, big time here, right? So we look at where we grow potatoes in the world versus where they're from. They're from right here. So we still grow them where they're from. The people there still grow them, and they grow quite a bit of them. But we grow them all over the world in lots of different environments. And we got all these new varieties that we can have, you know, the potential of, because the conditions in Uzbekistan are going to be different than the conditions in Idaho and different than the conditions down here in South Africa. So we got to have different potato varieties for that, right? But if we don't, and if we have potatoes that are adapted to grow really good in Bolivia and Peru, and they do great there, and we take them to Ireland, where they like to grow a lot of potatoes, and a disease happens to come in because we've got a lack of genetic diversity because we've been growing the same kind of potatoes in the same area for generation upon generation, and we've had inbreeding suppression. Well, now we've got no genetic diversity. All of our crops are genetically identical. Sound kind of like hybrid seeds? Does kind of sound like modern agriculture, don't it? So we got all these genetically identical seedlings growing out there in the field, and a disease that can hurt them comes along, and it gets on one, and it's like smorgasbord, and it just wipes them out, kills everything. And this is what happened in Ireland for the Irish potato famine, and many people starved to death because they were relying on those potatoes for their food. It got potato blight, and they all died, and the people all died. Then a whole lot of people migrated to the U.S. They immigrated during this time because they were starving to death. Okay, so this is what happened. So it's crazy. So that ends our diversity and ecosystem talk. Make sure you watch the video, Poll the Poll. It's pretty cool. And do the quiz for chapters 4 and 5. Read chapter 6 in your book. We're going to talk about mass extinctions and global change next. And you want to make sure that you kind of start thinking about the presentation guidelines. Because, you know, you have to do a presentation for this course, and you have to video yourself doing it and submit it on Blackboard and all that. So start looking at those. It's not due until, you know, the end of the semester, but you might want to work on it and think about it a little bit ahead of time.